History and Nature. Post-war era, 1945 to 1960. Prosperity returned to Canada during the Second World War and continued in the following years, with the development of universal health care, old age pensions, and veterans' pensions. The financial crisis of the Great Depression led the Dominion of Newfoundland to relinquish responsible government in 1934 and become a Crown colony ruled by a British governor. In 1948, the British government gave voters 3 Newfoundland referendum choices: remaining a Crown colony, returning to Dominion status, that is, independence, or joining Canada. Joining the United States was not made an option. After a bitter debate, Newfoundlanders voted to join Canada in 1949 as a province. The foreign policy of Canada during the Cold War was closely tied to that of the United States. Canada was a founding member of NATO. Canada wanted to be a transatlantic economic and political union as well. In 1950, Canada sent combat troops to Korea during the Korean War as part of the United Nations forces. The federal government's desire to assert its territorial claims in the Arctic during the Cold War manifested with the High Arctic Relocation, in which Inuit were moved from Nunavik, the northern third of Quebec, to barren Cornwallis Island. This project was later the subject of a long investigation by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. In 1956, the United Nations responded to the Suez Crisis by convening a United Nations emergency force to supervise the withdrawal of invading forces. The peacekeeping force was initially conceptualized by the Secretary of External Affairs and future Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. Pearson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for his work in establishing the peacekeeping operation. A Royal Canadian Air Force CIM-10 Beaumark missile. Acquired as an alternative to the defunct Avro Aero program, its adoption garnered controversy given its nuclear payload. Throughout the mid-1950s, Prime Ministers Louis St. Laurent and his successor John Diefenbaker attempted to create a new, highly advanced jet fighter, the Avro Aero. The controversial aircraft was cancelled by Diefenbaker in 1959. Diefenbaker instead purchased the Beaumark missile defense system and American aircraft. In 1958, Canada established, with the United States, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. There were voices on both left and right that warned against being too close to the United States. Few Canadians listened before 1957. Instead, there was wide consensus on foreign and defense policies from 1948 to 1957. Bothwell, Drummond, and English state that support was remarkably uniform geographically and racially, both coast to coast and among French and English. From the CCF on the left to the Social Credit on the right, the political parties agreed that NATO was a good thing, and communism a bad thing, that a close association with Europe was desirable, and that the Commonwealth embodied a glorious past. However, the consensus did not last. By 1957, the Suez Crisis alienated Canada from both Britain and France. Politicians distrusted American leadership, businessmen questioned American financial investments, and intellectuals ridiculed the values of American television and Hollywood offerings that all Canadians watched. Public support for Canada's foreign policy came unstuck. Foreign policy, from being a winning issue for the Liberals, was fast becoming a losing one. 1960 to 1981. In the 1960s, the Quiet Revolution took place in Quebec, overthrowing the old establishment which centered on the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Quebec and led to modernizing of the economy and society. Quebecois nationalists demanded independence, and tensions rose until violence erupted during the 1970 October crisis. John Saywell says, "The 2 kidnappings and the murder of Pierre Laporte were the biggest domestic news stories in Canada's history." In 1976, the Part 1 Québécois was elected to power in Quebec, with a nationalist vision that included securing French linguistic rights in the province and the pursuit of some form of sovereignty for Quebec. This culminated in the 1980 referendum in Quebec on the question of sovereignty association, which was turned down by 59% of the voters. The Proclamation for the National Flag of Canada, issued in 1965. In 1965, Canada adopted the maple leaf flag, although not without considerable debate and misgivings among large number of English Canadians. The World's Fair titled Expo 67 came to Montreal, coinciding with the Canadian centennial that year. The fair opened on April 28, 1967, with the theme Man and His World and became the best attended of all BIE-sanctioned world expositions until that time. Legislative restrictions on Canadian immigration that had favored British and other European immigrants were amended in the 1960s, opening the doors to immigrants from all parts of the world. While the 1950s had seen high levels of immigration from Britain, Ireland, Italy, and northern continental Europe, by the 1970s immigrants increasingly came from India, China, Vietnam, Jamaica, and Haiti. Immigrants of all backgrounds tended to settle in the major urban centers, particularly Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. During his long tenure in the office, 1968 to 1979, 1980 to 1984, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau made social and cultural change his political goals, including the pursuit of official bilingualism in Canada and plans for significant constitutional change. The West, particularly the petroleum-producing provinces like Alberta, opposed many of the policies emanating from central Canada, with the National Energy Program creating considerable antagonism and growing Western alienation. Multiculturalism in Canada was adopted as the official policy of the Canadian government during the prime ministership of Pierre Trudeau. 1982 to 2000. In 1981, the Canadian House of Commons and Senate passed a resolution requesting that the British Parliament enact a package of constitutional amendments which would end the last powers of the British Parliament to legislate for Canada and would create an entirely Canadian process for constitutional amendments. The resolution set out the text of the proposed Canada Act, which also included the text of the Constitution Act, 1982. The British Parliament duly passed the Canada Act 1982, the Queen granting royal assent on March 29, 1982, 115 years to the day since Queen Victoria granted royal assent to the Constitution Act, 1867. On April 17, 1982, the Queen signed the proclamation on the grounds of Parliament Hill in Ottawa, bringing the Constitution Act, 1982 into force, thus patriating the Constitution of Canada. Previously, the main portions of the Constitution had existed only as an act passed of the British Parliament, though under the terms of the Statute of Westminster, it could not be altered without Canadian consent. Canada had established complete sovereignty as an independent country, with the Queen's role as monarch of Canada separate from her role as the British monarch or the monarch of any of the other Commonwealth realms. In addition to the enactment of a constitutional amending formula, the Constitution Act, 1982 enacted the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter is a constitutionally entrenched Bill of Rights, which applies to both the federal government and the provincial governments, unlike the earlier Canadian Bill of Rights. The patriation of the Constitution was Trudeau's last major act as Prime Minister. He resigned in 1984. On June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182 was destroyed above the Atlantic Ocean by a bomb on board exploding. All 329 on board were killed, of whom 280 were Canadian citizens. The Air India attack is the largest mass murder in Canadian history. The Progressive Conservative (PC) government of Brian Mulroney began efforts to gain Quebec's support for the Constitution Act, 1982 and end Western alienation. In 1987, the Meech Lake Accord talks began between the provincial and federal governments, seeking constitutional changes favorable to Quebec. The failure of the Meech Lake Accord resulted in the formation of a separatist party, Bloc Québécois. The constitutional reform process under Prime Minister Mulroney culminated in the failure of the Charlottetown Accord, which would have recognized Quebec as a distinct society but was rejected in 1992 by a narrow margin. Under Brian Mulroney, relations with the United States began to grow more closely integrated. In 1986, Canada and the U.S. signed the Acid Rain Treaty to reduce acid rain. In 1989, the federal government adopted the Free Trade Agreement with the United States despite significant animosity from the Canadian public who were concerned about the economic and cultural impacts of close integration with the United States. On July 11, 1990, the Oka Crisis land dispute began between the Mohawk people of Kanesatake and the adjoining town of Oka, Quebec. The dispute was the first of a number of well-publicized conflicts between First Nations and the Canadian government in the late 20th century. In August 1990, Canada was one of the first nations to condemn Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and it quickly agreed to join the US-led coalition. Canada deployed destroyers and later a CF-18 Hornet squadron with support personnel, as well as a field hospital to deal with casualties. Following Mulroney's resignation as Prime Minister in 1993, Kim Campbell took office and became Canada's first female Prime Minister. Campbell remained in office for only a few months. The 1993 election saw the collapse of the Progressive Conservative Party from government to 2 seats, while the Quebec-based sovereigntist Bloc Québécois became the official opposition, 234. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien of the Liberals took office in November 1993 with a majority government and was re-elected with further majorities during the 1997 and 2000 elections. In 1995, the government of Quebec held a second referendum on sovereignty that was rejected by a margin of 50.6% to 49.4%. In 1998, the Canadian Supreme Court ruled unilateral secession by a province to be unconstitutional, and Parliament passed the Clarity Act outlining the terms of a negotiated departure. 2000 to present. Environmental issues increased in importance in Canada during the late 90s, resulting in the signing of the Kyoto Accord on Climate Change by Canada's Liberal government in 2002. The accord was in 2007 nullified by Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Conservative government, which proposed a made-in-Canada solution to climate change. Canada became the 4th country in the world and the first country in the Americas to legalize same-sex marriage nationwide with the enactment of the Civil Marriage Act in 2005. Court decisions, starting in 2003, had already legalized same-sex marriage in 8 out of 10 provinces and 1 of 3 territories. Before the passage of the act, more than 3,000 same-sex couples had married in these areas. The Canadian Alliance and PC Party merged into the Conservative Party of Canada in 2003, ending a 13-year division of the Conservative vote. The party was elected twice as a minority government under the leadership of Stephen Harper in the 2006 federal election and 2008 federal election. Harper's Conservative Party won a majority in the 2011 federal election with the New Democratic Party forming the official opposition for the first time. Under Harper, Canada and the United States continued to integrate state and provincial agencies to strengthen security along the Canada-United States border through the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. From 2002 to 2011, Canada was involved in the Afghanistan War as part of the U.S. Stabilization Force and the NATO-commanded International Security Assistance Force. In July 2010, the largest purchase in Canadian military history, totaling $9 billion Canadian dollars for the acquisition of 65 F-35 fighters, was announced by the federal government. Canada is one of several nations that assisted in the development of the F-35 and has invested over $168 million Canadian dollars in the program. Map with areas labeled where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada took part in outreach and statement gathering events over the impact of Canadian residential schools with the Indigenous peoples of Canada. In 2008, the Government of Canada formally apologized to the Indigenous peoples of Canada for the residential school system and the damage it caused. The government set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada that year to document the damage caused by the residential school system and the reconciliation needed to proceed into the future. It provided a call to action report in 2015. On October 19, 2015, Stephen Harper's Conservatives were defeated by a newly resurgent Liberal Party under the leadership of Justin Trudeau and which had been reduced to third-party status in the 2011 elections. Multiculturalism, cultural and ethnic diversity, has been emphasized in recent decades. Ambrose and Mutta conclude that Canada's unique multiculturalism policy, which is based on a combination of selective immigration, comprehensive integration, and strong state repression of dissent on these policies. This unique blend of policies has led to a relatively low level of opposition to multiculturalism. COVID-19 arrived in Canada in January 2020, marking the beginning of a pandemic in the country that caused over 41,000 deaths. Historiography. The conquest of New France has always been a central and contested theme of Canadian memory. Cornelius Janin argues. The conquest has remained a difficult subject for French-Canadian historians because it can be viewed either as economically and ideologically disastrous or as a providential intervention to enable Canadians to maintain their language and religion under British rule. For virtually all Anglophone historians, it was a victory for British military, political, and economic superiority which would eventually only benefit the conquered. Historians of the 1950s tried to explain the economic inferiority of the French Canadians by arguing that the conquest destroyed an integral society and decapitated the commercial class, leadership of the conquered people fell to the church, and, because commercial activity came to be monopolized by British merchants, national survival concentrated on agriculture. At the other pole are those Francophone historians who see the positive benefit of enabling the preservation of language, religion, and traditional customs under British rule. French-Canadian debates have escalated since the 1960s, as the conquest is seen as a pivotal moment in the history of Quebec's nationalism. Historian Jocelyn Letourneau suggested in the 21st century, 1759 does not belong primarily to a past that we might wish to study and understand, but, rather, to a present and a future that we might wish to shape and control. Anglophone historians, on the other hand, portray the conquest as a victory for British military, political, and economic superiority that was a permanent benefit to the French. Alan Greer argues that Whig history was once the dominant style of scholars. He says the interpretive schemes that dominated Canadian historical writing through the middle decades of the 20th century were built on the assumption that history had a discernible direction and flow. Canada was moving towards a goal in the 19th century, whether this endpoint was the construction of a transcontinental, commercial, and political union, the development of parliamentary government, or the preservation and resurrection of French Canada, it was certainly a good thing. Thus the rebels of 1837 were quite literally on the wrong track. They lost because they had to lose. They were not simply overwhelmed by superior force, they were justly chastised by the God of history. My name is Arya. Please like, share, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can be the first to be notified whenever we post. You won't regret it.